All right, let's dive right into this deeply tragic and honestly profoundly cinematic explainer. Today we're looking at the ancient and often totally overlooked story of Dinah from the book of Genesis. We're going to unpack a narrative that isn't really about the sweeping triumphs of biblical patriarchs. Instead, it's about the devastating consequences of crossed boundaries, compromised identities, and the incredibly heavy cost of trauma. We're setting a pretty grave historical tone right from the jump here, because this isn't just some dusty story about ancient tribes. It's really a mirror held up to human nature itself. To truly grasp the weight of this narrative, we actually have to start at the very end. Consider this haunting deathbed curse from Jacob, spoken directly over his own sons, Simeon and Levi. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. I mean, wow. These are the chilling words of a father who, instead of seeing the proud protectors of his household, looks at his sons and sees only instruments of cruelty. This cold open plunges us right into the dark, serious consequences of the events we're about to explore. So how on earth did a family of the covenant reach such a fractured, blood-stained breaking point?
Well, that brings us to Act 1, the peril of the threshold.
The events that ultimately led to Jacob's curse all kicked off on the plains of Shechem. Now, this wasn't just a spot on a map. It was a zone of intense cultural hostility, literally a boundary line between two entirely different worlds. The source text tells us that Dinah, the daughter of Leah, crossed over into the territory of the Hivites. She stepped out of the protective, though maybe stifling, atmosphere of Jacob's covenantal encampment and right into a world governed by entirely different gods and, quite frankly, much darker customs. Her curiosity was, profoundly human. But her attempt to bridge the gap between her people and the Shechemites meant leaving a space defined by the worship of Yahweh and stepping straight into a land of incredibly precarious alliances. Essentially, what she stepped into was a massive vacuum of accountability. We're talking about a space completely lacking ethical safeguards, a place where a woman's covenantal status offered absolutely zero protection against predatory entitlement. Stepping beyond the perimeter of her father's house exposed Dinah to profound, hidden peril. Back in the ancient Near East, crossing into a vacuum like this meant she was no longer governed by the ethics of her family. Instead, she was at the mercy of the opportunistic, highly predatory dynamics of a pagan city-state. And the specific threats of Shechem were incredibly multi-layered. Beyond just the sheer cultural differences and that power vacuum we just talked about, there was this devastating threat of commodification and a really dark predator versus host dynamic. Historically, in the ancient Near East, it was actually a fairly common, brutal strategy to use the violation of a noble woman to force a political marriage, simply to absorb a wealthier clan. Shechem, the son of Hamor, didn't look at Dinah as a guest or even as an equal. He and his entire city viewed her strictly through the prism of utility. She was seen as a commodity, literally a trophy of cultural conquest, whose violation was immediately twisted into a calculated political maneuver to absorb Jacob's prosperous clan. Which leads us directly into Act 2, the corruption of righteous indignation. So when Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, hear about this defilement, their reaction completely shifts the story from a personal tragedy into an absolute catastrophic massacre. Their response descends so rapidly into an abyss of calculated malice. The brothers demanded that the men of Shechem undergo circumcision in order to intermarry with Jacob's family. But here's the horrifying part. They used this sacred sign of the covenant as a deeply cynical instrument of deception. They used it to facilitate mass murder while the men were incapacitated. Just think about the dark irony of that for a second. In their absolute fervor to avenge their sister, they carried out this horrific act of violence under the guise of piety. They completely desecrated the very covenant they claimed to be defending. And this highlights a really crucial point, this stark contrast between defending honor versus actually seeking justice. The brothers fundamentally misunderstood the very nature of dignity. They actually believed they could somehow reclaim Dinah's honor by bathing an entire city in blood. But dignity cannot be restored through the degradation and destruction of others. Their worldly wrath treated real people as pawns, choosing deceptive violence instead of pursuing any sort of reconciliation or justice that respected the holiness of their calling. In the end, they became the exact evil they claimed to oppose.
Let's move on to Act 3, the cost of the lost blessing.
You see, actions taken in the heat of misguided rage always carry long-term spiritual consequences. Jacob's deathbed curse that we talked about earlier, that wasn't just some poetic flair. It was a literal, historical punishment. The first major consequence is the scattering of the tribe. Because Simeon and Levi prioritized vengeance over divine wisdom, their tribal influence was permanently curtailed.
Simeon was eventually absorbed right into the tribe of Judah, and the Levites were forced to find their redemption in a role of service to the sanctuary rather than enjoying any sort of independent tribal sovereignty. The second consequence is the immense loss of primogeniture's weight. Through their rash, explosive violence, they completely forfeited the spiritual leadership that could have been theirs. They proved once and for all that the sword is an incredibly poor, destructive instrument when it comes to preserving the covenant of grace. This brings us to our final section, the application, the silenced, and the sacred.
So how do we actually bring this ancient, brutal story into our modern context? What are the real spiritual lessons here regarding boundaries, trauma, and our loyalty to God? Well, there are a few core theological takeaways we really need to distill from this narrative. First is the absolute danger of mixing our covenantal identity with worldly wrath. Loyalty to God is never a license to act in ways that contradict his character. Second is the trap of defending honor over seeking justice. We have to advocate for dignity without adopting the tactics of abusers. Third is the consequence of forsaking divine wisdom, because our choices made under trauma will always ripple into our legacy. And finally, God as a witness to the silenced. We're reminded here that true loyalty to God means holding our reactions captive to his standards, not just giving in to our immediate burning anger. This all points to a much broader truth: viewing the covenant as a sanctuary. God's boundaries aren't just arbitrary restrictions designed to stifle the human spirit. Not at all. They are protective barriers against a predatory world. The source material heavily emphasizes the gravity of even so-called minor trespasses, because stepping outside God's protective covering initiates this terrible cascade of devastating consequences. It leaves us wide open and vulnerable to being treated as commodities for the gain of others, rather than as human beings uniquely valued by God. But amidst all the deep theology and the complex tribal politics we've discussed, Dinah remains the central, aching tragedy of this whole thing. She is a woman whose very life was used as the currency for a blood feud. Her brothers claimed to act in her name, yet their horrific actions left her more isolated than before, cementing a legacy of shame. Her name was essentially erased by the roar of the larger narrative, totally subsumed by the big history of patriarchs and their power struggles. Which leaves us with this very deliberate, haunting question. Are we listening to the voices that society has rendered silent? In the grand, chaotic drama of life, God does not ignore the individual caught in the whirlwind. To truly serve God is to pay close attention to the Dinahs of our world. I really want to challenge you to look into the eyes of the forgotten and realize that the story of the covenant is entirely incomplete without them. Because until we advocate for a dignity that doesn't depend on tribal power or status, we are missing the very heart of what is sacred. Think about that as you navigate your own boundaries today.